Okay, welcome everyone to the Pydata Sri Lanka YouTube channel. And what we are going to be discussing today is going to be Python variables and constants. But before we get into a little bit of coding, let's try to understand what exactly a Python variable is. Think there is this magical box in front of you that allows you to store whatever that you want in it. And at any given point in time, if you want to change what is inside it with something else or replace what is inside it with something else, you have that ability as well. And once you replace it, the item that is going to be containing within this magical box is only going to be that item. So a variable in Python is similar to that. It's basically a container that will store some sort of data for a given period of time. And you can change that particular data at any given point in time. So until it is changed, that particular container or that variable will contain that particular data that you have assigned. Another cool thing to note about Python is it is a dynamically typed language, which means you don't need to declare the type of the variable at the very beginning. Unlike certain programming languages, which requires you to state exactly what the data type of that particular variable is, in Python, based on the value that you assign to that particular variable, it will automatically infer the data type of that variable based on the data type of the value that is being assigned to it. So you don't need to go to the hassle of declaring the type of the data at the very beginning as well. So I hope that you guys understood what a variable is. Think of it as a container that will store some sort of data, and at any given point in time, if you want to change what is inside it, you have the capability to do that as well. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit of coding so that you would understand how to declare a variable as well as to print whatever the values that is inside of it. Okay. Um, but to give you a little bit of an introduction about this IDE, this is the Jupyter Notebook, and it is a very useful IDE if you are in the process of learning Python because it allows you to execute cell by cell. So this is considered to be a cell, and you can execute the program cell by cell. So if you use something like VS Code or PyCharm or Spider, you'll have to execute the um, entire script if you want to get an output. But if you use Jupyter notebooks, you can, since you have the capability to execute it cell by cell, it's good for presentations as well as it's good for learning purposes as well. Okay. So now let's get into it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to declare a variable, right? And for that particular purpose, we need to initially come up with a name for it. We need to come up with a name for the variable. So here I'm gonna say X. I'm gonna name the variable as X. And in order for us to tell Python, look, I'm gonna be assigning a value to it, you can use the equal operator that exists in Python, which will basically say, look, to this variable name X, I'm going to be assigning this value. And then you can assign whatever that you want. So in this case, I have assigned the value number one. You can also assign other values to other variables. You can declare as much variables as you want. So in this case, I have declared three variables, X, Y, and name, and each of these containing different data types, which we will discuss a little later. But just understand, you can declare as much variables as you want. And in order for us to run this and execute it, you can either use this run button within this particular ID or as a shortcut. If you hover over it, you see there is a shortcut for it, and that is Shift Enter. So I'm going to use Shift plus Enter, then it will automatically execute. Now we have declared the variable. Now we have told Python, look, there's going to be three variables, X, Y, and name, and the values has been also assigned. Now we need to check if we can print whatever the value that is contained in that variable. So how do you do that? Basically, you can use the inbuilt print function, And within parentheses, you can mention the variable name that you want to print. So in this case, I want to print x. Now, if you run this, it will say, look, within x, the value of number one is there. So when you print this, it is actually going to be printed to the console, and that is what is happening here as well. So if you go ahead and print y, you will see that it is 1.2. Now, I told you at the very beginning, now a variable is like a container that will store some sort of data. And at any given point in time, if you want to change it, you can change it, which is basically like overriding a variable. So in this case, let's say now the value of x at this very moment is 1. But if I want to change the value of x to, let's say, 2.5, I can do that. And if you print this, you will see that the value of x is no longer 1 but rather 2.5. So that is where you have replaced the item within this magical box with another item. Okay, so we now understand exactly how to declare a variable, and we also understand how to print a variable. Now let's try to figure out a couple of primitive data types that we can store inside a variable. Okay, so the first primitive data type that can be stored in a Python variable is integers. And what an integer is basically is whole numbers. So for an example, numbers like, counting numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are whole numbers. Another easy way to understand what an integer is, think of it as a number which does not have any decimal places. So let's say I'm going to declare a variable called x, and if I say 1, if I assign the value 1, that is basically an integer. But if for some instance I declare a variable called y, and if I assign a value, a number with decimal places like 1.2, this is no longer an integer. This is what we call as a floating number. So that is the second data type that I want to mention. So you have integers, which are basically whole numbers, and if there is a number with a decimal place, we call it a float. Now, if you want to investigate, right, the type of this particular variable, right, sometimes you might have this massive amount of variables, and at some point, if you're debugging, you might want to identify the type of this variable, right? There is an inbuilt function within Python called type. So how you identify the data type is simply you say print, then you say type, and within type you can ask for which variable that you want to identify the type of. So let's say for this example, we want to identify the type of x, and if you print it, you will see that the type of the variable x is indeed an integer. If you do the same for y, right, you will see that it is a float. So those are two primitive data types that exist in Python. Another data type is the string type. A string type is basically text, and in order for us to kind of tell Python, look, I'm going to be declaring a string variable, you can use inverted commas, either double inverted commas or single inverted commas. So in this case, I'm going to use double inverted commas, and you can write whatever the value that you want. You can say Pydata 1, and if you go and print the type of this, okay, you will see that it is a string. Now, let's say for an example, I go and change this to 2.5. Now, 2.5 is a floating number, right? But since it is within these inverted commas, we are telling Python, no, no, this is going to be a string. This is not going to be a floating number. So if you execute it and if you try to run the type of it, you'll see that it's still a string. Okay, so those are three different data types. The other type is the Boolean type. So Boolean type can take only two values. Either it can be true or it can be false. Only one of those two values can a Boolean type take. So let's say now here I'm going to assign the value true, and if I run this and if I print type of the Boolean, you see that it is indeed the Boolean type. The final primitive data type that I want to discuss is the none type. So imagine you declare a variable at the very beginning and you don't know the value that is supposed to go into it, but you want to declare that variable. Whereas in some case, you might have declared the variable and then at some instance, that particular item has to be removed from it. So in that case, you can use the none type just to indicate to Python, look, this variable is declared, but there is nothing inside it. So you can say val equals null. And if you again go and print the type of val, you will see that it is indeed a null type. Okay, so those are the primitive data types that you can embed into a Python variable. If you were to go back to what we discussed, it is the data types are integers, floats, strings, booleans, and null types. Okay, another interesting thing that you need to know is naming a variable. So there are things that you can do and things that you can't do when it comes to naming a variable. So let's look at the things that we can do. So if you want to name a variable by starting the name with an underscore, this is completely allowed in Python. You can run this. You can start a variable name with some sort of a alphabetical character and then follow it up with numbers. Um, and this is also allowed in Python. But what is not allowed in Python is a variable name starting with a number. So if I say one name in this case, and if I try to assign a value to it, it will throw a syntax error saying, look, this is not allowed in Python. You need to make sure that whatever the variable name that you're going to be mentioning either starts with an underscore or a character that is not numerical. Okay, so one name is not allowed. Okay, another important thing to notice or to keep in mind is that Python is case sensitive. So what this basically means is, let's declare a variable called val, okay, val, with the first letter V being uppercase. And I'm going to assign a value called Pydata1. And if you declare another variable for val again, but the V being lowercase, and if you assign a value called pydata2, Python will recognize these even though it is val, the variable name is val, since there is a character difference in the sense one is uppercase, one is written with an uppercase V and the other is written with a lowercase v, Python will recognize these as two different variables. So if you try to print uppercase VAL, you will see that it is printing pydata1. And if you try to print lowercase val, it is actually printing pydata2. So always remember, Python is case sensitive, and you need to make sure that when you are trying to, let's say, override another variable, you use it with the proper casing. Okay. And the final thing to note, this is very important when it comes to code readability and to make sure that another developer life is easy. Um, because sometimes you write code that is not readable, but it's good practice to make sure that your code is going to be readable. And one of the key things for that is to make sure when you are naming a variable, you name it with a proper name, which explains exactly what that variable does. So if you take these examples, the first ones that I did, they are not meaningful. But if you, let's say that we want to store a string variable called introduction to Python. Okay, so when you're trying to store this, you need to make sure that particular variable is meaningful. So let's name it something like title of session, and you can even put an underscore and say it's a string variable. This is not required, and then you can store the uh, the string variable that you want to store. Introduction to Python. Now, the title of the session basically describe what exactly is stored in it, and it's much more easier for another person to kind of read it. Don't try to write very long variable names as well, but you try to make whatever the variable that you're declaring meaningful. Okay, cool. So that's all about variables. Let's try to recall everything. We learned about how to declare variable. We learned how to print it. We learned what are the primitive data types of that can be embedded into a variable, how to identify that variable type using the type inbuilt function. We also learned some conventions that we need to kind of follow when we are naming a variable. So that's all about variables for now. Now let's move on to the final part, which is constants. You see, constants, as the name suggests, is something that should not change. It should remain as a constant. So there is no there's no proper way to indicate to Python, look, there, this is going to be a constant. But as developers, there are certain naming conventions that is being followed in order to indicate a variable that is declared as a constant to other developers so that they would not change the value that is inside this constant. So this is very important when you are trying to kind of store a constant with a password or an API key. You don't want people to change it unless it is required, right? So in that case, the naming convention that you should use is that you need to mention the name of the variable in all upper cases. And if there is more than one word, then you need to use underscores for it. So let's say for an example, we want to declare the value of pi as a constant. Then you declare it with all purchased all uppercase letters, because then it will the next developer will understand exactly this is basically a constant. Then let's say that you want to declare max value in some of your operations or in your functions. In that case, you can declare it with uppercase letters. You can do this for API keys, passwords, and all of these things. But for Python, this is just another variable. So you can do whatever the operations that you did initially with this as well. So if you print, let's say pi here, it will print what it is there within this particular variable. And let's say if you want to check the type of it, right? Type of pi, you will see that it is indeed a float value. Because for Python, it doesn't really consider whether it's a constant or not. um, it's just another variable for Python. But for developers, since it is in uppercase, it's indicating, okay, this should not be changed because this is a constant. Okay, so that's about it for this particular video. We talked about Python variables and constants, and we talked about data types and naming conventions. And we'll see you back again with another video, which will be exciting. Thank you, guys.